He describes the march as follows in his official report. Pursuing the Ashcake Road, we crossed the central RR about 10 a.m. Approaching the Totopotomoy Creek, the federal picket crossed to the south side of the stream and partially destroyed the bridge, and, by felling trees across the road farther on, attempted to delay our advance. After the Texas skirmishers had gallantly crossed over, Riley shelled the woods for the purpose of driving the enemy from it, in order that we might safely effect a lodgment beyond the creek. Whiting rapidly repaired the bridge, and the march was resumed. At night, the 3 divisions bivouacked near Hundley's Corner. We distinctly heard the rapid and continued discharges of cannon which announced the engagement of Gendry A.P. Hill with the extreme right of the enemy. General Stewart, in his official report, says, "At Dr. Shelton's we awaited the arrival of General Jackson, sending a squadron in advance to seize and hold the bridge at the Totopotomoy. The enemy, anticipating us, had torn up the bridge and held the opposite bank and obstructed the road, without, however, making any determined stand. Captain W. W. Blackford, Corps of Engineers, assigned to duty with my command, set about repairing the bridge, and in a half hour, with the details furnished him, the bridge was ready." Passing Pole Green Church, General Jackson's march led directly toward the crossing of Beaver Dam Creek opposite Richardson's. Reaching that point, he bivouacked for the night. General Trimble, in his official report, writes, "On the 26th we moved with the army from Ashland in a southerly direction, passing to the east of Mechanicsville in the afternoon, and at 4 p.m. distinctly heard the volleys of artillery and musketry in the engagement of General Hill with the enemy. Before sundown the firing was not more than 2 miles distant, and in my opinion we should have marched to the support of General Hill that evening. Now we will go back to the Chickahominy, where Branch's brigade, some 8 miles above the rest of A.P. Hill's division at Meadow Bridge, is under arms and expecting to receive the signal to advance not later than 4 a.m. It does not come until after 10 o'clock. As soon as it was received, Branch crossed the Chickahominy and moved toward Mechanicsville, the enemy's pickets falling back before him. At one point, the road pursued by Branch approached within a short distance a road upon its left, which was being followed by Ewell's column, and the 2 generals had a brief meeting, but there was no other communication between the columns until the next day. Meanwhile, since an early hour in the morning, the divisions of A.P. Hill at Meadow Bridge and of D.H. Hill and Longstreet at the Mechanicsville Bridge, 2 miles below, had been under arms and anxiously awaiting the sound of Jackson's guns. President Davis was on the ground, having ridden out from Richmond, not only to see, but anxious to participate in, the coming battle. A few siege guns had been mounted on the low bluffs along the Chickahominy Valley, and they were now manned for use in case our crossing at the Mechanicsville Bridge was resisted. But hour after hour passed, and there came no sound of conflict from the direction of Jackson's advance. At 3 p.m. A.P. Hill, of his own motion, decided to wait for Jackson no longer. It is strange that he should have taken this responsibility without orders from Lee, who was within 2 miles, and who, it seems, would not have approved it. Henderson states that a message from Lee, ordering Hill to postpone all further movement, arrived too late. Doubtless Lee wished now to make a fresh start on the morrow, as Johnston had wished at 7 Pines. The enemy made slight resistance to Hill's advance, and fell back through Mechanicsville to his works behind Beaver Dam Creek, opening the road to Longstreet's and D.H. Hill's divisions. A.P. Hill's division moved so rapidly that it arrived at Mechanicsville 1.5 miles ahead of Branch's brigade. No advantage was gained, however, by thus anticipating the coming up of Jackson. The enemy held, behind Beaver Dam Creek, an entrenched position quite impregnable to assault. It had not been intended to attack it with infantry, but to threaten it with artillery, while Jackson passed to the rear and cut off the enemy's retreat. Already Jackson, in spite of his slow march and the time wasted at Totopotomoy Creek, was within 3 miles of the enemy's line of retreat and with no force opposing him but a few cavalry. but here he stopped his march, which had only been about 13 miles that day, and went into bivouac, regardless of the roar, not only of artillery, but presently of musketry also, appealing to him from Mechanicsville. For with haste and poor judgment, Davis, Lee, Longstreet, and the two Hills, not content to merely cannonade the enemy in his position, were beginning to wreck whole brigades of infantry, as must now be told. The position was one in which good troops could repulse treble their numbers if assailed in front, but it was easily turned. Jackson, 3 miles off to the northeast, was already in easy reach of Porter's line of retreat, and had but to push his advance a mile or two, and Porter would have been compelled to retreat precipitately or be caught in a trap. On the 26th of June, in the latitude of Richmond, the sun rises at 4:38 a.m. and sets at 7:27 p.m., and twilight lasts until about 8:30 p.m. There was no moon. As already told, General Jackson arrived at Hundley's Corner at 4:30 p.m. and went into bivouac there for the night, after having marched from Ashland about 11 miles off in an airline, and perhaps 12 to 14 by the roads traversed. At Mechanicsville the firing commenced at 3 o'clock, and rapidly grew heavy. It was at first a long-range duel with the Confederate siege guns on the Chickahominy, and then with the field batteries accompanying Confederate brigades as they came up. A.P. Hill's 5 brigades of infantry were also put into action as soon as they could be formed, and advanced within range of the enemy's entrenched lines, when they opened fire both of artillery and infantry. Thus the battle was maintained until dark. Meanwhile, as the hours of daylight were closing, under urgent messages from Lee and President Davis, 2 regiments of Ripley's brigade of D.H. Hill's division were launched in a direct charge on perhaps the very strongest point of the whole Federal position. A more hopeless charge was never entered upon. They were the 1st N.C. and the 44th Gavrekars raw regiments, which had never before been under fire. Their behaviour illustrated the morale inspiring the army. Had they been given anything to do which it was possible to do, they would have done it and become seasoned veterans in their first battle. They dashed across a wide plain through a storm of musketry, shells, and canister, and some even went across Beaver Dam and into the entangled slashing close under the Federal lines. There they were killed until their bodies laid, as a Federal account described it, as thick as flies in a bowl of sugar, before the survivors realized the trap into which they had been sent and got back as best they could. The 1st N.C. suffered 142 casualties, including all 3 field officers and the adjutant. The 44th Gay lost 335, including its Cole and Lieutenant, a regimental loss seldom equalled in so short a time. The total casualties of this battle were about 1,350 and included 14 field officers. The Federals reported their loss as 361. Porter, in his report, says that only during the night, by reports from scouts and outposts, did the Federals become aware of the close proximity of Jackson's force, and it was recognized at once that McClellan's army was in a very critical condition. He writes, "But for the conception of the idea of a flank movement, changing our base by the left flank to the James River, our position would have left but one alternative, a hasty abandonment of our attack on Richmond and a retirement by the way we had advanced." This conception, as before told, had been developed 2 weeks before by Stuart's raid, and it had not only been developed, but, what was much more important, already transports had been loaded, and many important preparations for carrying it into execution had been made in advance. The matter was decided in McClellan's mind during that night, though no orders were issued. Porter's corps was ordered to withdraw to a strong position upon the north bank of the Chickahominy, in close connection with the rest of his army. This position, about 3 miles in rear of Beaver Dam, had already been noted and selected by the chief engineer, General Barnard. Porter, however, remained in his entrenched position until daylight, and then began to withdraw down the Chickahominy in good order, carrying with him guns of position which had been posted along the Chickahominy. The Confederate batteries reopened their fire at dawn, and the Federal rearguard replied heavily for over 2 hours. Had Jackson's corps made an early start, and been pushed as Jackson was wont to push, both before and after this 7 days' spell, he would have struck Porter's corps on the flank as it marched toward Cold Harbor. But the advance was so late and slow that when at last, about 8 o'clock, it appeared in rear of Porter's position, having marched about 3 miles, the last Federal soldier had withdrawn, and Jackson's artillery fired by mistake into the head of Hill's advancing column. The trap was sprung, but the bird had flown. General Gregg gives the following account. Early in the morning of the 27th, I received orders from General A.P. Hill to take the advance with the 2D Brigade and to drive the enemy from their position on Beaver Dam Creek at Ellison's Mill. The brigade advanced to the attack. Slight resistance was made here by the enemy, and the passage of the stream, which presented a strong natural obstacle, was gained. Many Confederate soldiers, wounded or killed in a preceding unsuccessful assault, lay in the road toward the crossing of the creek and had to be moved aside to allow the passage of our artillery. A small bridge, broken up by the enemy, had also to be repaired. This was toward 8 o'clock in the morning. Crossing Beaver Dam Creek, the brigade advanced along the road among piles of knapsacks and other property, and burning stores abandoned by the enemy with skirmishers, out to the front and left. Coming into the edge of an open field, Captain Cordero's company, 1st SC, deployed as skirmishers, were fired on by artillery in front, and Lieutenant Heiser and a soldier were wounded. Captain W.T. Haskell's company of the same regiment, advancing in open order, discovered that the forces meeting us in front from the left were those of Maj. General Jackson, and entered into communication with them so as to avoid the risk of future mischiefs. At last, then, the morning half gone, the 4 Confederate divisions were united and within 3 miles of the enemy. Porter had gone into the position selected behind Boatswain's Creek, with 3 divisions of infantry, 6 regiments of cavalry, and 20 batteries, in all about 27,000 men and 80 guns. The position was naturally strong, and it was being strengthened hourly with abatis and rifle pits. Its development covered only about 2 miles of convex front. Its left flank rested on the open Chickahominy bottom, where heavy batteries from the south side secured it from being turned. Its right flank was its weak point, its protection there being only tangled thickets, which also covered much of the front. Where this was lacking were generally 3 lines of infantry, partially under cover, and abundant artillery so placed that its fire was over the heads of the infantry. His force was enough to cover his front 6 deep. 2 bridges gave connection to the south side, and over them, during the action, McClellan sent Slocum's division, 9,000, of Franklin's corps with 2 batteries, and French's and Meagher's brigades of Sumner's corps, as reinforcements, say about 14,000 men. Porter himself was perhaps the hardest opponent to fight in the Federal army. No one in it knew better how to occupy and prepare his ground for defence, or was more diligent to do it, and in his corps were concentrated all of the regular regiments of the old Federal army. To attack such a position was no easy proposition, and Lee's force, checked and weakened by the ill-advised affair at Mechanicsville, had no margin to spare over the size of its task. Indeed, had McClellan reinforced Porter as he should have done, with a whole corps, he might have won a great victory. But he allowed himself to be imposed upon by the demonstrations made by Magruder and Huger, under orders from Lee, and neither attacked with his left nor strengthened his right sufficiently. He weakly left the question of sending reinforcements to his 4 corps commanders. Franklin sent Slocum's division, and Sumner sent French's and Meagher's brigades, but Keyes and Heintzelman reported that they could spare nothing. As it was, therefore, the fight should result in Lee's favour by a reasonable margin, provided it was well managed and its force not squandered in partial attacks. But this took place to an extent perilously near losing the battle. It did lose the precious hours of daylight necessary to gather any fruits of victory, and made the victory much more bloody than it need have been. The importance of time should have been appreciated, and the march pushed to locate the enemy's new position and develop it with strong skirmish lines. Then, at the most favourable points, our utmost strength should have been marshalled and concentrated for simultaneous assaults of infantry, supported upon each flank by concentrations of batteries. It was but waste of time and blood to launch any small assault against that position, as had been done at Beaver Dam. The fact that we finally carried the position by a general charge, after the repulse of many partial ones, shows that our men were good enough and that we had enough of them to have made a success early in the afternoon, had our energies been first concentrated for the effort. During the morning of the 27th, the Confederates moved with a slowness only to be understood by remembering the inexperience, in handling such large bodies, of many of our generals and staff officers. By noon, however, we had developed the enemy's position. On our left, Jackson was at Cold Harbor with 4 divisions, his own, Ewell's, Whiting's, D.H. Hill's, and Lawton's large brigade in addition. He confronted the Federal right. A.P. Hill, with Longstreet in reserve, confronted their left. Porter, in the Century, writes, "The advance column of these troops, Jackson's, came a little earlier than those under Longstreet and A.P. Hill, but were more cautious, and, for some hours, not so aggressive. What happened was this. D.H. Hill's division, crossing the Chickahominy behind A.P. Hill, had been pushed out to the left by Lee's battle order, and brought up behind and in support of Jackson's forces early on the 27th. But in the slow marching of the morning, D.H. Hill, with characteristic aggressiveness, had managed to pass Jackson's force and to take the lead. On approaching Cold Harbor and discovering the enemy's position, Hill at once moved his division up to the edge of the swamp held by the enemy upon the other side, and opened upon them with a battery. His battery was quickly answered by 10 guns, and after a brief action was withdrawn, crippled. Just at that juncture came orders from Jackson withdrawing Hill into some woods in rear, where the head of Jackson's long column was already standing halted. In his official report, Jackson thus explains his object in this manoeuvre. Soon after, General A.P. Hill became engaged, and, being unacquainted with the ground and apprehensive, from what appeared to me to be the respective positions of the Confederate and Federal forces engaged, that if I then pressed forward, our troops would be mistaken for the enemy and be fired into, and hoping that Gen A.P. Hill and Longstreet would drive the Federals toward me, I directed General D.H. Hill to move his division to the left of the road, so as to leave between him and the wood on the right of the road, from which he is withdrawing D.H. Hill, an open space across which I hoped the enemy would be driven. Thus arranged, it was in our power to distinguish friend from foe in case the enemy should be driven as expected. It is not necessary to comment upon this too elaborate explanation of how more than a half of Lee's army was paralyzed for 3 hours, just on the verge of battle, further than to say that the inaction and the excuse for it are both unlike anything ever seen in Jackson before or after these 7 days. D.H. Hill was withdrawn about 2 p.m. It was about 2:30 p.m. when A.P. Hill's advance, pressed as rapidly as he was able to bring up his 6 brigades, developed into a battle. Porter, in Battles and Leaders, further describes the fight made by this single division, about 12,000 men, which had had, only the evening before, sharp losses at Ellison's Mill. Soon after 2 p.m., A.P. Hill's force between us and New Cold Harbor again began to show an aggressive disposition, independent of its own troops on its flanks, by advancing from under cover of the woods, in lines well formed and extending, as the contest progressed from in front of Martin's battery to Morrell's left. Dashing across the intervening plains, floundering in the swamps, and struggling against the tangled brushwood, brigade after brigade seemed to almost melt away before the concentrated fire of our artillery and infantry. Yet others pressed on, followed by supports as dashing and as brave as their predecessors. Despite their heavy losses and the disheartening effect of having to clamber over many of their disabled and dead, and to meet their surviving comrades rushing back in great disorder from the deadly contest. For nearly 2 hours the battle raged, extending more or less along the whole line to our extreme right. The fierce mingling of artillery and infantry, the crash of the shot, the bursting of shells, and the whizzing of bullets heard above the roar of artillery and the volleys of musketry, all combined, was something fearful, Regiments quickly replenished their exhausted ammunition by borrowing from more bountifully supplied and generous companions. Some withdrew temporarily for ammunition, and fresh regiments took their places, ready to repulse, sometimes to pursue, their desperate enemy, for the purpose of retaking ground from which we had been pressed, and which it was necessary to occupy in order to hold our position. It is to make one almost sick of regret to read of such desperate valour so lavishly wasted upon an impossible effort, while 3 times as many men stood by and looked on. A. P. Hill's account of it in his official report is as follows. The incessant roar of musketry and deep thunder of artillery told that the whole force of the enemy was in my front. Branch becoming hard-pressed, Pender was sent in to his relief. Field and Archer were also directed to do their part in this murderous contest. Braxton's battery, accompanying Archer, had already opened. They were ordered to turn the enemy's left. These 2 brigades, under their heroic leaders, moving across the open field, met the enemy behind an abates and strong entrenchments at the base of a long wooded hill, the enemy being in 3 lines on the side of this declivity, its crest falling off into a plateau, and this plateau studded with guns. My front now presented a curved line, its convexity toward the enemy. Desperate but unavailing attempts were made to force the enemy's positions. The 14th SC, Collar McGowan, having hurried up from picket duty on the other side of the Chickahominy and arriving in the thickest of the fight, on the extreme left, made several daring charges. The 16th NC, Collar McElroy, and 26th Lt. Colin Gray, at one time carried the crest of the hill and were in the enemy's camp, but were driven back by overwhelming numbers. The 35th Ga, Colas Thomas, also drove through the enemy's line like a wedge, but it was all of no avail. Gregg and Branch fought with varying success, Gregg having before him the vaunted Zouaves and Sykes's regulars. Pender's brigade was suffering heavily, but stubbornly held its own. Field and Archer met a withering storm of bullets, but pressed on to within a short distance of the enemy's works, but the storm was too fierce for such a handful of men. They recoiled and were again pressed to the charge, but with no better success. These brave men had done all that any soldiers could do. Directing their men to lie down, the fight was continued, and help awaited. From having been the attacking, I now became the attacked, but stubbornly, gallantly, was the ground held. My division was thus engaged fully 2 hours before assistance was received. We failed to carry the enemy's lines, but we paved the way for the successful attacks afterward, in which attacks it was necessary to employ the whole of our army on that side of the Chickahominy. About 4 o'clock reinforcements came up on my right from Jenner Longstreet, and later Jackson's men on my right and centre, and my division was relieved of the weight of the contest. It was then continued on more equal terms, and finally the extreme left of the enemy's line was most gallantly carried by Hood's brigade. At 7 o'clock, the General-in-Chief, in person, gave me an order to advance my whole line, and to communicate this order as far as I could to all commanders of troops. This was done, and a general advance being made, the enemy was swept from the field, and the pursuit only stopped by nightfall and the exhaustion of our troops. The batteries of Crenshaw, Johnson, Braxton and Pegram were actively engaged. Crenshaw and Johnson pretty well knocked to pieces. Pegram, with indomitable energy and earnestness of purpose, though having lost 47 men and many horses at Mechanicsville, had put his battery in condition for this fight also. Lee's official report of this battle was not written until 8 months afterward, during which period Jackson's great military genius had manifested itself undimmed by any spell, and with increasing brilliancy on the fields of Cedar Mountain, 2nd Manassas, Harper's Ferry, Sharpsburg, and Fredericksburg. There was, most wisely and properly, every disposition to ignore and forget the disappointments felt during the 7 days, and the facts are glossed over with but brief and, as it were, casual mention, but they are plainly apparent. Lee by no means designed that A. P. Hill should alone engage the whole of Porter's force. He had had a personal interview with Jackson during the morning, and he knew that the head of his column was at Cold Harbor before 2 p.m. He expected it to immediately envelop and to turn Porter's right. He says that Hill immediately formed his line nearly parallel to the road toward McGahee's house and soon became hotly engaged. The arrival of Jackson on our left was momentarily expected, and it was supposed that his approach would cause the extension of the enemy's line in that direction. Under this impression, Longstreet was held back until this movement should commence. Hill went into action anticipating that Jackson's whole force would almost immediately be demonstrating or attacking upon the enemy's right flank. Why were they not? The head of the column was up, but it was hidden from the enemy's view in the woods, and its whole length, stretching for miles back, was simply standing idle in the road. Had the divisions even been closed up and disentangled from ordnance wagons, artillery and ambulances, and massed near Cold Harbor, the time would not have been entirely wasted, but this was not done. Stern necessity at length forced Lee to call upon Longstreet's division to aid A.P. Hill. 3 brigades were advanced within musket range as supports, but held back from the charge, while the remaining 3 were held near at hand and ready for action. At length, probably about 4:30, aroused to action both by the receding sounds of A.P. Hill's battle and by urgent messages from Lee, Jackson sent D.H. Hill's division back into the wood from which he had withdrawn it before 2 o'clock. He also sent a staff officer to his other divisions with instructions, quoted by Henderson, as follows. The troops are standing at ease along our line of march. Ride back rapidly along the line and tell the commanders to advance instantly in echelon from the left. Each brigade is to follow as a guide, the right regiment of the brigade on the left, and to keep within supporting distance. Tell the commanders, if this formation fails at any point, to form line of battle and move to the front, pressing to the sound of the heaviest firing, and attack the enemy vigorously wherever found. As to artillery, each commander must use his discretion. If the ground will at all permit, tell them to take in their field batteries and use them. If not, post them in the rear. That the troops were still standing halted along the line of march appears in the official reports, as well as in the time consumed before they were able to make their power felt in the battle. This required from 1 to 2 hours. Winder, commanding Jackson's division, reports, left bivouac near Totopotomoy Creek at about 5 a.m., being in the rear of the column, except 1 brigade. The march was slow and tedious, about 7 miles during the whole day. Firing was heard on the right. Between 4 and 5 p.m., I received orders from General Ewell to move up rapidly. I ordered the ordnance wagons and artillery to halt, and moved the brigade from the column filling to the right through a wood and swamp, to the point where I heard the heaviest fire. Lawton's official report says, in the order of march toward the battlefield on that day, my brigade brought up the rear of General Jackson's army, and was, therefore, the last to engage the enemy. I had remained at a halt for several hours, more than 2 miles from the point where the brigade afterward entered the field, and was not ordered forward until nearly 5 p.m. I then marched rapidly on, retarded much by the artillery and ambulances which blocked up the narrow road. While Jackson's troops were being brought up, the noise of battle waned, until an ominous silence seemed to possess the field as the sun drew near the horizon. Then the storm arose again and soon swelled to a magnitude never before heard on this continent. It was about 7 o'clock when at last D.H. Hill, Ewell, Lawton, and a part of Winder were all hotly engaged in the swampy tangle in front of the Federal right, and, though in great confusion, were making headway through it, and several Confederate batteries were returning the Federal fire. Opposite their left, Whiting's 2 brigades had just arrived, being directed by Lee as they approached from Cold Harbor, and 2 of Winder's brigades were also close at hand. A.P. Hill's brigades, though much diminished, were still holding their lines, and Longstreet was all in position. It was, practically, anybody's fight. A fresh division to Porter would have easily held his lines until night. It might even have enabled him to make an effective counterstroke, though the natural obstacles behind which his lines were located offered but 1 or 2 possible opportunities. 2 fresh brigades, French's and Meagher's, were en route to him, but were yet too far off to lend any aid. But Lee, at last, was putting forth his whole strength. He issued orders for an advance of every command, regardless of the troops upon its right or left. A general advance was made, not simultaneous in its beginnings, but pressed to success by Whiting's 2 brigades supported by Longstreet on our extreme right, by Lawton's and Winder's brigades in the centre, and by D.H. Hill with Garland's and parts of Ripley's and Rhodes's brigades upon our left. Had it been made 2 hours earlier, the fruits of the victory would have been important. As it was, they were so trifling as scarcely to be worth mention. Porter fell back in fairly good order under cover of his superior artillery, and our artillery could not be gotten forward across the swamps. Blessed night, for which the defeated prey had let down her mantle while the firing was still severe, and before we could even feel fully assured of our victory. Under its friendly cover and the protection of the French and Mega brigades, by 4 a.m. the whole Federal army had crossed the Chickahominy, damaging the bridges behind them, and leaving us, as the fruits of victory, but 22 guns, 2836 prisoners, and about 10,000 small arms. The Federal casualties were reported as killed 894, wounded 3107, missing 2836, total 6837. The Confederate casualties cannot be exactly divided, but I estimate the total losses of the different divisions for this battle as follows. The heavy character of much of the fighting is shown by some of the regimental losses, although in many instances the reports give only the total casualties for the 7 days, and do not distinguish between the battles. The charge by Whiting's 2 brigades, under Hood and Law, was notable for being driven home on the first effort, without halting to open fire. The 4th Tex, the 1st Regiment to enter the enemy's works, lost 44 killed and 206 wounded. There was no thicket or obstruction to seriously check the advance at this portion of the field, and part of the ground traversed was exposed to but little artillery fire. Trimble, of Ewell's division, made the following observations in his official report. The subjoined list of killed and wounded best shows the severity of the conflict, and a comparison of those of different regiments fairly illustrates the superiority of a rapid charge over a standing fight, not only as the best mode of securing victories, but doing it with smaller loss. The 15th Ala and 21st Gay, numbering 1315 men, stood under a destructive fire for an hour or more, returning the enemy's volleys all the time, and advanced half a mile, with only fragments of companies, at the close of the day. Their loss in killed and wounded was 251 men. The 16th Miss and 21st N.C., numbering 1,244 men, passed under as hot a fire an equal distance in 15 minutes, losing in killed and wounded only 85 men. Briefly, it may be said of this battle that it seems to have been left in the hands of the division commanders until it was nearly lost. Only at the last moment was the hand of the general in command revealed. But had Jackson's march that morning been pushed with the fierce swiftness natural to him on such occasions, and had he, during A.P. Hill's attack, thrown his whole force upon McClellan's right, a comparatively easy victory would have resulted. As has been stated, the enemy's right flank was his weakest point. It was not found. D.H. Hill would have attacked it even before A.P. Hill's battle, had not Jackson stopped and withdrawn him, instead of reinforcing and pushing him, as it was naturally expected that Jackson would do, although no man ever needed pushing less than D.H. Hill. In the Century War Book, he wrote of this occasion, "Had Jackson's command gone in on the left of the road running by the McGahey house, Porter's position would have been turned and the line of retreat cut off." Chapter 8. 7 Days' Campaign. The Pursuit. The day after the battle, Saturday the 28th, was dedicated to caring for the wounded, burying the dead, and collecting the scattered troops. During the night, McClellan began his retreat to the James, ordering Keyes, with the 4th Corps, to cross White Oak Swamp and take position to cover the passage of his trains, which were set in motion early on the 28th. Troops that had fought under Porter on the 27th were also sent forward across White Oak Swamp. On the Confederate side, it was unclear what the enemy would do. Ewell's and Jackson's divisions, not heavily engaged, were sent down the Chickahominy about 7 miles to Dispatch Station to monitor any disposition to cross the stream and retreat down the peninsula. Stuart's cavalry followed the railroad toward White House. Bottom's Bridge was found burned, and the next morning White House was also burned and evacuated. Sunday morning, the 29th, revealed the abandonment of the enemy's entrenchments opposite Magruder and Huger, with camps and depots being burned. It became apparent that McClellan's destination was the James River, prompting Lee to issue orders to his whole army for a vigorous pursuit. Magruder, immediately behind the enemy on the Williamsburg Road, was ordered to pursue down that road. Huger, on the Charles City Road, was ordered down that road. From the battlefield of the 27th, A.P. Hill and Longstreet were ordered to cross the Chickahominy at New Bridge and move by the Darbytown, the next road to the right. Ewell from Dispatch Station was to rejoin Jackson. Jackson, with the largest force, was directed to pursue by the shortest and most direct route. He was to cross the Chickahominy over the Grapevine Bridge and press directly upon McClellan's rear with his whole force. This comprised his own 3 brigades under Winder, Ewell's 3, D.H. Hill's 5, Whiting's 2, and Lawton's 1, in all 14 brigades, nearly 25,000 strong. Looking back upon the course of events, it is interesting to inquire wherein lay the weakness of this order, apparently so simple and obvious in its execution. Yet the pursuit, from this moment, was bootless and a failure. It did capture a few guns and prisoners, but it paid for them in blood a price far beyond their value. There were 2 ways in which Lee might have pursued. One is that just set forth. The recommendation of that method is that it seemed to reach the enemy with his largest forces by the shortest roads, but, per contra, is the consideration that on the shortest roads will be found the enemy's most formidable rearguards and obstructions. With energetic lieutenants, these may be overcome, but the chance exists whether the proper leaders will be at the right places. The alternate course would have been to leave the direct pursuit over the obstructed roads and against the enemy's rearguards to but 2 divisions, those of Magruder and Huger, while Lee himself, with Jackson, Longstreet, and A.P. Hill, moving swiftly around the rear by good roads, and reinforced by Holmes, put the bulk of his army, flushed with its recent victory, directly across McClellan's path near Malvern Hill. Not only would it count for a great deal that all the divisions should be under the personal eye of the commander, but there was strong probability that Lee might be able to force upon McClellan the disadvantage of having to take the offensive. On this occasion, as it turned out, Jackson was still under his spell and did nothing. Lee, having gone with Longstreet and A.P. Hill, lost touch of all 3, Jackson, Magruder, and Huger, and entirely failed to get any service from them for the 2 critical days, the 29th and 30th. The orders for the pursuit were given soon after sunrise on Sunday the 29th. Magruder had not entirely absorbed Lee's confidence that McClellan did not have in him the risking of a counterstroke. He knew that there were on the south side fully 60,000 Federals, and that between them and Richmond there were now but 25,000 Confederates. His official report thus describes the situation. I received repeated instructions during Saturday night from General Lee's headquarters enjoining upon my command the utmost vigilance, directing the men to sleep on their arms and to be prepared for whatever might occur. These orders were promptly communicated by me to the different commanders of my forces, and were also transmitted to General Huger on my right. I passed the night without sleep and in superintendence of their execution. Had McClellan massed his whole force in column and advanced against any point in our line, though the head of his column would have suffered greatly, its momentum would have ensured him success. His failure to do so is the best evidence that our wise commander fully understood the character of his opponent. Our relief was therefore great when intelligence reached us almost simultaneously from Colin Chilton and one of my staff, that the enemy, whose presence had been ascertained as late as 3:30 a.m., had evacuated his works and was retreating. Colin Chilton, who rode into my camp on Sunday morning, hurried me off to see Genon Lee on the 9-mile road, and I gave, while riding with him, the necessary orders to put in motion my whole command, which extended over a distance of some miles, directing General Griffith's brigade, which was nearest to the road, to advance at once from the centre, and ordering General Jones's division, in advancing, to incline toward Fair Oaks Station, as I had been informed that Major General Jackson had crossed or was crossing the Grapevine Bridge and would operate down the Chickahominy. Having overtaken General Lee, we rode together down the 9-mile road, and the general informed me of the plans which he had adopted for the pursuit of the enemy. They were as follows. Longstreet's division was to have crossed the new bridge and to take position on our extreme right, so as to intercept the enemy in his attempt to reach James River. Huger's division to march down the Williamsburg Road on my right flank, and Maj. General Jackson's division, which he stated had crossed or was crossing the Grapevine Bridge over the Chickahominy River, was to operate down that river on its right bank, while my own command would press him vigorously in front. At Fair Oaks Station, General Lee, having repeated his instructions, left the ground. I also dispatched a staff officer toward Grapevine Bridge, some 3 miles off, to ascertain the position of Maj. General Jackson's troops, which I had supposed from the statements above given had already crossed. In the meantime, Magion Bryan, the staff officer who had been sent to Maj. General Jackson, returned with his Jackson's engineer, Lieutenant Boswell, who reported that Maj. General Jackson was compelled to rebuild the bridge, which would be completed in about 2 hours. Major Bryan reported that Maj. General Jackson had crossed but a small portion of his infantry, not more than 3 companies, over the broken bridge. It is plain from this narrative that Lee's orders to Jackson to pursue by the Grapevine Bridge Road, above referred to, contemplated immediate performance on Jackson's part, and were given at an early hour on Sunday, the 29th. The name Grapevine, applied to this bridge, was taken from a ford of the Chickahominy well known in the neighbourhood, and reached by a country road which crossed the swamp by the ford. In building a bridge, the Federals utilized the road and built the bridge near it, but without disturbing the ford, which was practicable at this time, the river being low, even while waiting to repair the bridge. Meanwhile, too, New Bridge and another bridge, 3/4 of a mile above it, were opened by Lee's order on Saturday, the 28th. The extra distance, which would have been involved in marching from the battlefield to Savage Station by the New Bridge, instead of by the Grapevine route, was only about 3 miles. But this was Sunday, and Jackson gave it strict observance. The greater part of his troops remained in camp all day and until after midnight Sunday night. Then they made a start at, or before, 2:30 a.m. His official report entirely ignores the receipt of any orders from General Lee, but says, "The 28th and 29th were occupied in disposing of the dead and wounded and repairing Grapevine Bridge over the Chickahominy, which McClellan's forces had used in their retreat and destroyed in their rear. During the night of the 29th we commenced crossing the Chickahominy, and on the following morning arrived at Savage Station." Lee, in his official report, written as before told, 8 months later, accepts the excuse of Grapevine Bridge, as follows. Jackson's route led to the flank and rear of Savage Station, but he was delayed by the necessity of reconstructing Grapevine Bridge. Late in the afternoon, Magruder attacked the enemy with one of his 3 divisions, 2 brigades each, and 2 regiments of another. A severe action ensued and continued about 2 hours, when it was terminated by night. The troops displayed great gallantry and inflicted heavy loss upon the enemy. But owing to the lateness of the hour and the small force employed, the result was not decisive, and the enemy continued his retreat under cover of darkness, leaving several hundred prisoners, with his dead and wounded, in our hands. This was the insignificant outcome of the day, and in his reference to Jackson's delay and to the lateness of the hour and the small force engaged, one may easily read that he had hoped to have had a very different story. After giving Magruder his orders, but unfortunately without waiting to see that Jackson failed to arrive, Lee had gone over to the Charles City Road, where Huger was advancing, and thence he passed on to the Derbytown Road to join A.P. Hill and Longstreet. Soon after being left alone, finding that Jackson was not near, Magruder became alarmed at a demonstration of the enemy's rear guard and sent such urgent calls for aid to Huger that the latter halted 2 of his 4 brigades and marched back with them to Seven Pines. This loss for his division the cream of the day. Here he discovered the needlessness of Magruder's alarm, and getting urgent messages from Lee, he returned to the Charles City Road, marched down it until he found the enemy's pickets late in the afternoon, and went into bivouac. Lee was much disappointed that evening at the lack of results, and wrote Magruder the following note. General, I regret much that you have made so little progress today in the pursuit of the enemy. In order to reap the fruits of our victory, the pursuit should be most vigorous. I must urge you then again to press on his rear, rapidly and steadily. We must lose no more time, or he will escape us entirely. This note had also a postscript which will be quoted presently in another connection. Magruder had only brought into action 2 brigades, Kershaw's and Semmis's, and a half of Barksdale's. The force engaged against him had been Sumner's corps and Smith's division of Franklin's. Heintzelman's corps had also been present in the morning, but in the afternoon it had crossed White Oak Swamp at Brackett's Ford. The remaining 9 Federal brigades were, doubtless, too heavy a task for Magruder with only 6, but had Jackson with his 14 brigades been present in the morning, the enemy should have been routed. Doubtless Magruder should have employed twice the force he did engage and taken chances. His 2.5 brigades were overmatched, though they fought until dark, losing over 400 men and capturing prisoners from each of the 3 divisions opposed to them. They reported next morning 400 dead left by the enemy on the field, but such reports are always overestimated. Jackson arrived in person at Magruder's headquarters near Savage Station at 3:30 a.m. on Monday the 30th, and informed Magruder that his troops would be up soon after daylight. During the night, the entire Federal force had crossed the White Oak Swamp, and McClellan had accomplished 1/2 his retreat safely. He had had only about 16 miles to traverse, and his trains were now upon the last half of it, with his army well concentrated to protect his flank. With one more day, his column would be so shortened that no exposed flank would be left, and his whole army could be united in the rear of the train. This was, therefore, the critical day. Serious blows had threatened the Federals on the 26th at Beaver Dam, on the 27th at Gaines Mill, and on the 29th at Savage Station. But all had been escaped by bad handling on the part of the Confederates. Now a final opportunity was offered to repair all shortcomings, and every condition seemed favourable. Holmes's division, 6,000 strong with 6 batteries, had been brought from south of the James River, and was at Newmarket at 10 a.m. on the 30th. Longstreet, with his own and A.P. Hill's divisions, had bivouacked on the Derbytown Road the night before, and this morning they moved into the Long Bridge Road and soon found the enemy's line covering Charles City crossroads at Fraser's Farm or Glendale, and extending down the Quaker Road toward Malvern Hill. These 3 divisions, 14 brigades, numbered about 23,000 men. In addition to these, Lee, early on the 30th, had withdrawn Magruder's 6 brigades, now about 12,000 strong, from Savage Station, and brought them down the Derbytown Road within striking distance by 2 p.m., and had halted them at that hour near Timberlake's store. Huger's 4 brigades, about 9,000 men, were advancing down the Charles City Road, and were expected to open the action on this part of the field at an early hour. Either his guns or Jackson's would be the signal for Longstreet and A.P. Hill to take up the battle. Meanwhile, Jackson, only 4 miles off in an air line, but all of 15 miles by the public roads, the only ones generally known, was confidently expected to make up for his non-appearance of the day before by an early and very vigorous one this morning, assaulting the enemy's rear guard with his 14 brigades, 25,000 strong, and emulating the reputation he had made in the valley. Thus, with 44,000 men, all close at hand upon the enemy's flank, and Stonewall Jackson with 25,000 in his rear, fortune seemed at last about to smile broadly for once upon the Confederate cause. Unknown to us, another circumstance was rarely in our favour. The Federal Army was temporarily without a head. On the 29th, 30th, and July 1st, McClellan, on each day, left his army without placing anyone in command during his absence while he did engineer's duty, examining the localities toward which he was marching. Had the Confederates accomplished their reasonable expectations, the criticism of McClellan would have been very severe. On the Confederate side, Lee, with Longstreet and Hill in a field of broom grass and small pines, waited impatiently for the signal. He was so close in rear of his line of battle that men and horses among the couriers and staff were wounded by random shots. For quite a time, too, President Davis and his staff were present, in conference with the generals, while missiles grew more frequent and wounded men began to come in from the front. For hours we stood there waiting for something which never happened. Every minute that we waited was priceless time thrown away. 12 o'clock came and the precious day was half gone. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock followed. Even 4 o'clock drew near, and now, whatever was started, would be cut short by night. Our great opportunity was practically over, and we had not yet pulled a trigger. We had waited for either Huger or Jackson or both to begin, and neither had begun. As Beauregard, at Bull Run, had sent word to Ewell to begin, and then had gone to the centre and waited, as Johnston, at Seven Pines, had given orders to Hill and Longstreet about beginning, and then gone to the left and waited. So now Lee, having given orders beforehand to both Jackson and Huger, had passed on to the right and was waiting, and in every case the opportunity passed unimproved. Briefly, this is what had happened, beginning with the extreme right column under Holmes, which, with Magruder's column, was to support Longstreet's right. The river road from Newmarket to Harrison's Landing passed under and around Malvern Heights, between them and the river. From a point on this road, perhaps 1.5 miles from the river, across low, flat ground, one could see a considerable expanse of the Malvern Heights, 1,000 yards off across the meadows on the left, and over these heights were passing many of the 5,000 wagons composing McClellan's trains. No target is more attractive to an artillerist than his enemy's wagon train, and 6 rifle guns of Holmes's were sent down in the meadows to fire upon these wagons. Lee also saw the position and approved the attack, and directed Holmes to bring up his whole division to support the guns. But no sooner did the 6 guns open than they were replied to by 30 of the heaviest rifles of the Federal Artillery Reserve, which, escorted by only about 1,500 infantry under Fitzjohn Porter, had just arrived on Malvern Heights to occupy the position. The fierce fire of this great battery was quickly aided by the fire of heavy guns from the gunboats in the James, lying in Turkey Bend, and directing their fire by wigwag signals between their mastheads, and the Federals on the heights. The 6 guns were quickly wrecked. 2 caissons were exploded, and so many horses killed that the guns were with difficulty withdrawn. No fire is so appalling to unseasoned troops as that of heavy artillery received in a thick wood, where every shot cuts limbs and smashes trees around them, even though the actual damage from it may be trifling. Holmes's whole division, concealed in the woods in the vicinity of the 6 guns engaged, was now exposed to such a fire, converging from opposite quarters. There was but one thing to do, and that was to get away. Some commands, especially among the infantry, behaved well and withdrew in perfect order. Some were thrown into confusion, and among some cavalry commands and light artillery a stampede took place. 2 guns which had not been engaged were entangled in the woods and abandoned, and many men were run over and injured. Altogether, the confusion was so great that Lee directed Magruder's 6 brigades to march to Holmes's support, though they could have done no good, as there was nothing for them to attack or defend. Thus, Holmes and Magruder, 18,000 men, were diverted from the real work of the day. This was just about to begin when this side issue of the cannonade of Malvern Hill was ventured upon. The total casualties in Holmes's division, including 15 wounded among the 6 guns, were 2 killed and 49 wounded, besides some injured in the stampede. Let us next turn to Huger's division. On Sunday the 29th, the division made but a very short distance down the Charles City Road for two reasons. Two of its brigades were called back and had some miles of extra marching and countermarching in the hot sun by Magruder's false alarm when he found that he was not supported by the proximity of Jackson, as has been already told. The other two brigades thought it imprudent to pass any road on their left leading across White Oak Swamp until it had been reconnoitred, as it was known that a large force of the enemy was still on the other side. At the first of these crossroads, a force of the enemy was discovered attempting to cross to the south side. It was driven back, and the resulting skirmish consumed the day. It seems strange that Lee, though at no great distance on the next day, the 30th, should have still failed to see Huger and either to bring him to the battle, which was waiting for his arrival, or to order it to proceed without him. But there is no intimation in the reports of any communication, nor in Huger's proceedings of any consciousness that important action was waiting upon him. At another swamp crossing, called Fisher's, Huger's column, Monday morning, discovered that the enemy's forces on the opposite side had been withdrawn. Wright's brigade was then ordered to investigate. He crossed the swamp with his brigade and got into the deserted camps of the enemy on the north side, picking up a few prisoners and finding some abandoned stores. By 2:30 p.m. he had made his way entirely across to the main road where Jackson, as is yet to be told, with his 14 brigades, was standing at bay at the main crossing, called the White Oak Bridge. Jackson seems to have taken no special interest in Wright's arrival, though it proved that at least one unobstructed crossing of the swamp was within 3 miles. Jackson ordered Wright to return along the edge of the swamp to look for crossings as he went, and if he found one, to try and force it, but he sent neither staff officer to bring back a report nor reinforcements to aid if any favourable point should be found. Apparently he was satisfied to remain where he was and to do only what he was doing. Nothing. Wright started back, and at 1.5 miles came to Brackett's Ford, a well-known road, across which a large part of the Federal forces had crossed during the night, and which they had then obstructed by cutting down trees and destroying a small bridge. Pushing 2 companies of skirmishers through the swamp, Wright captured the enemy's picket force on the south side, but saw, beyond the picket, a force of the enemy with artillery, too strong for his brigade, so he withdrew. Continuing his march along the edge of the swamp another 1.5 miles, he found a cow trail which led him across it about 3/4 of a mile below his crossing of the morning, and here he encamped. The occupation of Huger's other brigades during the day is given as follows in his official report. The troops bivouacked in their position while it was dark and resumed the march at daylight, Monday, June 30th. Mahone advanced cautiously, captured many prisoners, and killed some cavalry scouts, one bearing an order to Kearney to retire and keep a strong battery of artillery with his rearguard. After passing Fisher's house, we found the road obstructed by trees felled all across it. General Mahone found it best to cut a road around the obstructions. For such work we were deficient in tools. The column was delayed while the work was going on, and it was evening before we got through and drove off the workmen who were still cutting down other trees. As we advanced through the woods and came to an open field on high ground, P. Williams on map, a powerful battery of rifled guns opened on us. General Mahone disposed his troops and advanced a battery of artillery, Mormons, and a sharp artillery fire was kept up for some time. The enemy's fire was very severe, and we had many men killed and wounded. List of casualties sent herewith: 25 killed, 53 wounded, total 78. I went to the front and examined the position. I withdrew most of our guns and only kept up a moderate fire. On our left, the White Oak Swamp approached very near. The right appeared to be good ground, and I determined to turn the battery by moving a column of infantry to my right. It was now dark. It seems incredible that this division within 4 miles of Lee could have been allowed to spend the whole day in a mere contest of axemen, wherein the Federals, with the most axes, had only to cut down, and the Confederates, with the fewest, to cut up and remove. The result could scarcely have been doubtful. Our army at this time compared with an organized and disciplined army about as a confederacy would compare with a nation. Each division was an allied but independent command, rather than a part of a single army. This will be even more evident in the story of Jackson's column now to be told. His command had always before acted alone and independently. Lee's instructions to him were very brief and general, in supreme confidence that the Jackson of the Valley would win even brighter laurels on the Chickahominy. The shortest route was assigned to him, and the largest force was given him. Lee then took himself off to the farthest flank, as if generously to leave to Jackson the opportunity of the most brilliant victory of the war. His failure is not so much a military as a psychological phenomenon. He did not try and fail. He simply made no effort. The story embraces 2 days. He spent the 29th in camp in disregard of Lee's instructions, and he spent the 30th in equal idleness at White Oak Swamp. His 25,000 infantry practically did not fire a shot in the 2 days. Here is the story. It has already been related that early Sunday morning, Lee, coming from Jackson's direction, told Magruder that Jackson had been ordered to pursue, and was even then supposed to be crossing the Chickahominy. Magruder was also ordered to attack the enemy, and he and his lieutenants soon sent messengers to establish communication with Jackson. Later, Magruder received a severe shock in the following note from General Jones, commanding one of his 3 divisions, of 2 brigades each. My Gen, Magruder. My line is for me to the left and somewhat to the front of Gen Cobb. I do not think it prudent for me to attack with my small force, unless there be a simultaneous attack all along our lines. I will keep a good lookout on my left. I had hoped that Jackson would have cooperated with me on my left, but he sends me word that he cannot, as he has other important duty to perform. Respectfully, D.R. Jones, Brig. Jenny. This note, taken in connection with the withdrawal of the 2 brigades which Huger had sent, depressed Magruder very much. Later in the evening he received some encouragement. Major Taylor of Lee's staff, bearing a message, arrived, hunting for Jackson. Upon being told that Jackson had been ordered elsewhere, as Magruder loosely quoted his message to Jones, Taylor did not hesitate to say that there must be some mistake. As he did not know the country, and Magruder had upon his staff a chaplain Allen who did know it, the message for Jackson was entrusted to Allen, and Taylor returned to Lee. But Lee's note that night to Magruder, already quoted, p. 138, contained a postscript as follows. P.S. Since the above was written, I learn from Madge, Taylor, that you are under the impression that General Jackson has been ordered not to support you. On the contrary, he has been directed to do so and to push the pursuit vigorously.